Good. So again, the idea is that we're in touch with someone who's sort of new to human synergistics, and we need to try to introduce the circumplex. This is typically to try to connect human synergistics models to two things. By far the most common are what we simply describe as outcomes or performance. So if we are a leadership team and we recognize that our people are not as innovative or collaborative as we would like for them to be, again, those being outcome criteria, then how do we introduce this model to help explain why that might be the case and what may need to change in order to improve? The other piece that I always try to connect these discussions to are values. That's especially true, again, when we talk to leaders and when we talk about organizational culture. How do we introduce and connect this model to their value statements and the values of the business? Ideally, we can do both of those things. And I always talk about culture initiatives. I very much think should be kicked off both in terms of the kind of behavior that we need to see to improve performance, as also that parallels with values and walking the talk, as it were. All right. So to be honest with you, most of these exercises we came up with in accreditation, or two of them at least, we came up with in our accreditation sessions to try to help people to, again, connect their experience with the styles that we have and see the connections more quickly and easily than oftentimes is the case. So let's jump into it. I try to do these things very early on. I've learned the best practice is not to try to teach HS models to people, at least clients initially. Let's save that for accreditation. What they need to do is understand how their experience and their goals are connected to this model. They don't need all of the psychological theory and research and 40 years of fascinating data. They just need to know how our issue connects to your model and how that makes sense. So let's get into it. The first is what we call the OCI Circumplex Quotes. That's the first exercise we'll be talking about. Then the other pieces are actually the third exercise I'll get to, which is sort of my favorite, which is the wall chart exercise. All right, so if we open the culture quote deck, we can see the following. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, if you're accredited in OCI and the culture level tools, you may be familiar with the fact that we can add open-ended questions to those projects. There are some constraints, but in any case, that is possible. These quotes actually came from actual client OCI projects in terms of their open-ended feedback. So these are real comments. And anyway, there are a variety of them. We've got about 30 of these various slides. And the point is that in accreditations, what we would typically do is have people, once they're introduced to this model, work in groups or pairs and go through some of these quotes and read them and then try to figure out which style of the circumplex we may be talking about. As a little bit deeper dive, to be honest with you, these cards are interesting because some of what you are reading in the cards is actually talking about culture. Some of these are related to outcomes. Here's a good example. You have to do whatever you're told. If you don't, you'll get a bad evaluation. That's actually referring to both culture and climate. So culturally, we feel that we are expected to simply do what we are told. The reason that we have that expectation in the culture is because of climate and how we evaluate performance in performance appraisals, which of course we assess in OEI. So you can dig quite deeply into this. The idea was that we would just try to think about what style this is primarily related to. But if you wanted to dig deeper, you can also use them to show the difference between culture and climate. In any case, I think it's quite useful for that and a nice way to introduce the model. For example, you could hand out a deck of these cards and ask leaders which of these things they see taking place in their business, which of them sort of resonate with them. And then once they've identified cards that we have seen, then I would introduce the circumplex. So again, I'm talking about doing this very, very early on in the discussion. And then as they learn about the circumplex, and again, you don't need to get into dramatic detail, but even a nice description of constructive behavior, aggressive versus passive, then the leaders oftentimes are able to associate those cards to the various sections of the model and start understanding what we're already seeing in our organization and where that maps to this profile. Of course, that tends to get people very excited, because one of the big challenges with culture is it's very hard to sort of get our hands around and hard to quantify and describe with a common language. And if they can go through this card deck and pull out 4 or 5 cards that I've seen my team do, and then begin to find out where that falls on the model, they begin to understand the value of this kind of models and data. Now, that's the sort of standard method. There's an advanced method that I very much like, and that is to give them either homework or to bring in a bunch of blank cards. And I've done this with leadership teams, and it works very nicely. If you can get them to complete this before you meet with them, great. If not, it'll take them about 5 minutes to fill out a card. So simple things to do in a break or after an introduction. So what I mean is, it's a very nice thing to try to get a hold of. Let me change over, apologies. Positive and negative experiences or perceptions. So for example, the way I did this the last time I ran the session was simply asking each leader to complete 2 cards. On one, they would write down something that they've seen their team or employees doing that was especially positive, something that they're really proud of, something that worked out very well, a positive experience in terms of how your employees worked, how they interacted with each other, how they approached their job. Secondarily, then we also need to hear from them in terms of what's not working. Obviously, that's oftentimes the focus of these discussions, what's not working and how we change that. I always like to get a positive point as well, so that we can see where these things play out on the model. So then again, the second card is simply a negative experience. We don't need to name names or point fingers, but, you know, can you give me an example of something that your team has done, or, you know, performance that was not what we want to see, members interacting in ways that are not appropriate, things that are inconsistent with our values that we've seen take place within the business. So at the end of the day, they end up with 2 simple cards, a few sentences on each about a positive and negative experience or observation in their business or team. Then the next piece that I would do is introduce, again, the circumplex, you know, the basic dimensions and clusters. And then as an activity, their task, to see if they've been paying attention, is to read their cards, positive and negative, and to try to associate that card with a style on our model. This can be done in groups. I know there are a few people in this call right now who have actually done this, so hopefully, again, at the end, we'll have the chance to hear from you. But I find this is very, very powerful because if you're familiar with our tools, again, you'll find that really almost whatever their positive and negative experiences are, find a place on this model. Secondarily, the positive experiences consistently end up on constructive styles, and the negative experiences consistently end up on defensive styles. Now, the next thing that's really nice about this is you almost get a flavor of what's going on in the current culture. Because if you do this with a leadership team of, you know, 15, 20 leaders, especially if it's across locations and functional areas, you might notice that all of those cards, especially the negative experiences, start falling on one cluster or even a few styles in the circumplex. They can see that all the positive stuff is up here in the blue, but boy, we've got all of these cards, the negative cards, that are falling on oppositional and avoidance, for example. And then they start to see the patterns that are taking place in their business. They also start to see that the experiences that I'm having with my team are not identical, but similar to the patterns that other leaders are seeing with their teams, and that there's something else going on here sort of below the surface. And if we have a model to understand this, then we can start to identify what those patterns are, put a language around them, and talk about how we change and move forward. So again, in the Hightails file, you'll have those cards, but from my experience, I prefer to work from blank cards. That allows people to really freely describe for themselves what their wins and losses are as leaders or as teams, and where those fall on our model. And this is a beautiful thing, because then they're sort of automatically connecting with the Circumplex. And by the way, if you've ever tried to introduce the Circumplex and have had pushback on aggressive styles specifically, no, we need those red styles, those are great. I tend to find this solves that problem for you, or that challenge for you. They'll find that their negative experiences keep falling on those red styles as well, and they answer for themselves that those patterns are not appropriate. Really helps them to get over the terminology challenge, at least in English, and I know in other languages as well. You know, competitive sounds great, perfectionism sounds perfect. What's the problem with those styles? But if we can start to see, you know, my people keep missing deadlines because they're worried about the font on the PowerPoint, and we need to deliver here, then they start to realize that that perfectionism, what that is, and why that may be holding their teams back. So that's the card exercise. It's sweet, simple, and hopefully helpful. There we go. Now, you can also do fun things like add values to your ideals in terms of what are your current experiences and what are the values of the business, and do similar things. I'll talk more about the adaptability of this. Hopefully you can see already that this is something that you can adapt a little bit. The wall chart exercise that I'll get to in a moment is specifically very flexible. So I'll talk about how that plays out. Okay. Now, the next model I wanted to discuss, and not, to be honest with you, in too much detail, is a model that comes from a textbook you may be familiar with, Conscious Business by Fred Kaufman. If you're familiar with the book, very nice text, does a very good job of introducing concepts like culture and how to sort of simply conceptualize them. In that book, really beginning right in the beginning, page 12, 13, and specifically on page 14, they begin to introduce a model that's described as the I, we, it model. So let me share my screen once again. And find where I've hidden that from myself. There we go. All right, so I'm just going to put one PowerPoint up. The graphic is pretty simple and straightforward. The idea is, and this is a very nice way again to introduce the tools, is that we can have a discussion with leaders, and the book of course breaks this down into a little bit more detail. When we think about the I within the organization, which is sort of you as an individual, there are some pieces that we need to think about. You know, what am I trying to achieve? How do I get that? And how do I know I'm performing, basically? So that's broken down across these three areas. But I know that several of the consultants and consulting organizations who use human synergistics tools most prolifically and to be honest with you, most effectively, do introduce it using this I, we, it model. And of course, the concepts from Conscious Business, which, by the way, the leadership teams or the organization may already be familiar with. So this is another little strategy that may help. If you're accredited in HS tools, you probably have recognized that the patterns and styles and concepts and theories that we talk about in this model are not unique to this model. Whether it's transactional analysis or theory X versus theory Y leadership or the I, we, it model, you can consistently find parallels between the HS models and other theories and models of culture, leadership, and behavior, psychology, and so on. So one of the sneaky methods is to figure out what the client organization or the leadership team are already familiar with. If this is a textbook that they've all read and very much use and apply, then that's a very good way to introduce and step in with HS models. I'm not going to do a wonderful job of introducing this, to be honest with you, because I haven't used it more than maybe twice. But I will point out that if you're interested in the I, we, it model, I'll go into it a little bit more detail. But one of the most prolific consultants who uses this model very heavily and to introduce this to organizations is going to be presenting at our next regional meeting, which is going to be held also virtually online. So hopefully you would be able to attend. So you'll be hearing from us about that session, but that consultant will take us through exactly how they pitch this model and then bridge into human synergistics in that session. So that should be very helpful for you. In any case, I'll try to do it some justice based on how I've seen them present this as well. The concept is, again, that we open with sort of a flexible open forum where we talk to leaders about what needs to be taking place, what should be going on in their business. By the way, I've mentioned this before in culture development, that when we meet with clients initially, most of the conversation is about what is not working, what needs to change, whose fault that is, and these sorts of things. The extent to which we can shift that discussion toward, okay, but what do we need moving forward? What should your people be doing? That goal-oriented, more developmental conversation, the better. And that's essentially how we start here. The concept is that when leaders think about their business or people think about the organization as a whole, the things that need to be happening are either things that I am responsible for. So what do I need to do my job effectively? It is things, then it's the I. There are things that we need to be doing as a group. So it's not enough to just have a collection of individuals who know their job and can do it well, but we need to do things. We need to collaborate. We need to share information. We need to, leaders, we need to point out when people are doing things positively and effectively. If they're not, we need to give them some direction in terms of how they can improve. We need to be doing things. The it refers to essentially the task that we're trying to accomplish. We need to deliver quality. We need to deliver things on time. We need to be compliant. The sort of quality, quantitative performance of the business. Those three pieces, then, in the way a lot of times this is introduced, is just to ask leaders what needs to take place in your business broadly. And they'll talk about all of these things. And you basically, in face-to-face, you can start writing these on a flip chart. And as they talk about what I need to do, that goes in one corner. As they talk about what the team and the people we all need to do, that goes in one part. And the it stuff ends up in another place. And then you can start illustrating them to really everything that they're talking about in terms of what we, the organization, I within it, and what we're trying to deliver, all can fit within those three broad categories. Then the way this is bridged is to bridge those 3 points, the I, we, and it, to the circumplex model. And what you really find is that the I is essentially represented by self-actualization, the 12 o'clock position. The we is represented by both humanistic encouraging and affiliative behaviors. And by the way, if you just ask them what should be going on, how do we need to interact, how do I need to approach my work, you will be getting descriptions of constructive behavior that you can really map directly to the circumplex. The it is primarily, of course, with relation to achievement, kind of with the exception of things like innovation, creative thinking, and behaving in ways that are consistent with values, which again would fall under self-actualization. The point is that leaders can then kind of map out everything that needs to be going on in their business, recognize that they all fall essentially into one of these 3 categories, and then recognize that those are promoted by these styles of behavior toward the top of the model. Now, the nice thing about this is it sort of bypasses the discussion about defensive behavior as a whole. We don't really need to get in too much into the defensive styles. We're really talking about where we are going as a business, how we need to perform and deliver, how I fit in, and whether we're fulfilling that through the organization's culture. So that is the I, we, it model. Again, we'll get more content on that when we do the regional meeting. And by the way, we'll also be recording that so that you can see this done in real time by a real professional consultant who's done that many times before. All right, very good. That brings me to the third exercise, which is what we call lovingly the wall chart exercise. So the wall chart exercise is, I can actually show you very simply. The purpose of these was essentially to quiz people on the styles, meaning in the beginning of the accreditation, we'd of course introduce the Circumplex model and walk them through all 12 styles. And then kind of after lunch, we would ask them to walk out in the hallway, and in the hall, we would have 12 posters hanging on the wall. And you can see they're just labeled A, B, C, D, and so on, all the way through to L. Each of them represents one style from our Circumplex. So if you actually look at them, ask everyone what they think before acting, follow orders even if they're wrong, be predictable, right? So dependent behavior. Each one is describing one style. The idea was that they then walk around with this little scoring sheet at the end, which I provided for you, of course, so they can actually do this as an exercise. And then they, try to figure out which of those charts is achievement, which of them is affiliative, so on and so forth through the model, and fill in the letter, showing that they're connecting this pattern with the styles. Now, while that's nice for accreditation, I actually prefer this model as a way to introduce the tools. And it's very flexible, so I'll try to give you a few different examples of how this is done. The way I typically do this in the very beginning of culture accreditations is face-to-face, and you can also do this virtually as well, is, hang these up on the wall, and again, make this sort of the very first conversation that we're having, and ask leaders to go around and look at those wall charts and actually vote for which of those things essentially should be taking place in their business, which of those things should not be taking place. So almost similar to the card exercise, walk around and read these things. And I actually give them, I'm gonna sneak away for 1 second, I'll show you. Pretty simple. Little stickers. I give them 2 blue stickers. Each individual gets 2 positive votes, what should be going on, and each individual gets 2 negative votes for what we don't want taking place. The blue and red is not necessary. We're not really referring directly to the styles. We're just asking people to put some votes in terms of what do you want to see from your people and what is really not appropriate here. They will go up and vote. It does not take them particularly long. I think I give people usually 10 minutes so they can read each one and vote very quickly on what they want to see and what they don't. Then as a next step, I typically introduce the Circumplex model, go through the styles quite briefly, and then I actually score their description. And you can do this face-to-face simply using a flip chart. You can do it virtually using a PowerPoint that I've actually provided for you in the Hightail. So it has the Circumplex and then little blank circles that you can add the scores to. What you will find is that, of course, the positive votes typically end up, and it's more than typically, it's consistently, end up on the blue constructive styles, and the negative votes for the things that we don't want taking place very much consistently end up on the defensive styles. I have been doing this as an introduction to the Circumplex really in every accreditation for the last 3 or 4 years. And in that time, I've done it with hundreds of organizations and leadership teams. Honestly, I have had 2 individual votes end up in places where you might not expect. I had 1 positive vote for affiliative behavior 2 years ago, approval, of course, and 1 positive vote for dependence, singular votes. Otherwise, they end up so consistently where you'd expect. It's a beautiful thing. This enables, again, leaders to tell themselves what should be going on and what should not be going on. And again, if you've had the conflict or challenge of talking people out of defensive styles, especially aggressive styles, this is like the magic trick, because they really recognize they do not want those patterns when they are looking at the actual behaviors in the model. So I've been talking about this in terms of positive and negative. That's not really specific enough in my opinion. So let me give you a few different ways that I like to use this specifically. So if you're talking to leadership teams and they're talking about all the various problems they have in the business, try to narrow those down to some outcomes. So, you know, engagement is poor, communication is terrible, customer orientation is a mess. Fine. Now, I want you to walk over and look at these wall charts and put your little positive votes on those things that you honestly believe is going to improve the customer orientation, the communication, and so on, and those things that you recognize are going to stand in the way or are counterproductive. So this is what I call the outcome orientation, relating this to performance. And you can do this with several different things all at once, meaning which of these is going to help communication, innovative thinking, and customer orientation. And they won't have any problem mapping that out. Then you introduce the circumplex, and again, let's see what you said will help. And lo and behold, it's all the blue stuff, and everything in the red and green is holding us back. And then you have a very positive message to them. Instead of telling them human synergistics knows that blue behavior works and red and green do not, you can come with them with a positive message saying, hey, congratulations. What you described is exactly what 45 years of research has found as well. You guys really do know what should be going on in organizations. The question isn't what we need to be doing, it's how do we get there? And now you're changing the conversation into a goal-oriented developmental initiative. Very, very helpful. Okay, so if it's not outcome focused, what else can we do? Another one that I very much like is to use values. Which of these styles, those charts, are describing things that are consistent with your value statement or are going to help your people to live the values? Which of those things are not consistent with the values or are going to prevent people from walking the talk, if you will? It works just as well and along the lines of OCI ideal, but in any case, it works very, very nicely. Now, if you really want to get their attention, you can do both in the same session. So if I get 15 to 20 leaders, then I try to break them into two groups. This group goes to this side of the room and you put your blue dots on the things that are going to get the performance that we want. The other team go on this side of the room and you put the blue dots on the things that are consistent with our values versus inconsistent. Now you've really got them, because when they come back, lo and behold, you score them and they find that both what's going to get us where we want to be in performance and what is consistent with our values are the same for cultural styles that we need to be promoting. And those things that are holding us back in performance are the things that are inconsistent with our values. And now you've demonstrated them the beautiful synergy that we find in our models around those things that are consistent with values also drive performance. And now we can justify that development initiative, not just for performance, but also to live the values and walk the talk. Okay. So those are sort of my favorite two. I'll give you another one, and that is to, if they're struggling for whatever reason to think about where we're going, then another good reference point is where you've been. So ask them to put their blue dots on those posters or wall charts that remind them of the most motivating, inspiring, helpful, wonderful leader that they've ever worked for or with. Which of these styles remind you of that person, and vote for that. Then, of course, also think of a negative example, a leader that was stressful and difficult and you never want to work with again, and put your red votes on there. No need to name names, but just think of that individual and that, you know, that experience that they have and can connect. Again, you get all the positive votes on the blue styles and all of the negative on the red and green, and that works nicely. Now, this also works in a scalable, meaning you can think of the most positive versus negative leader that you've experienced. You can think of the most positive versus negative team that you've been a part of, so on and so forth. So having those historic reference points where people can map that out on the posters or the wall charts, and then kind of at the end, you do this reveal to show them what they described and where does that fall on our model, is extremely powerful in helping them to not only connect with the model, but have clarity around what are constructive styles and why the defensive patterns are not appropriate and not helping. Believe it or not, I think that's all I have for the wall chart. It's a great exercise. Please try it out. I have had no challenges with people completing it. I've had no difficulty with, like I said, positive votes ending up in unexpected places. It's very, very helpful and really helps people to connect with the model. All right. Brings me to the last exercise. By the way, let me just share my screen. Sorry for the lack of coordination here. I also will share this slide. So this is sort of the way when we do this virtually, we can score this. So how many blue dots ended up on each of these styles, and how many red votes were there. And again, oftentimes, a lot like I mentioned with the card exercise, you'll start to notice a pattern. Here, for example, there's several votes. This is actually a client's responses, by the way. There are several votes for perfectionism as being particularly troublesome. So you might start to deduce that that's a pattern going on in the culture and something that they're noticing. And now they can finally understand what that is and have a language to associate with it. So we're also working on doing this virtually so that people can obviously, we've done this as well, vote and sort of click and add little red and blue dots to the posters on a PowerPoint like this. And then again, introduce the model, and then toward the end, score this and talk about what you said is driving us forward and back. And this way, again, you're not teaching it, it's coming from them. And then you can just add in that, yep, you're right. All of the research and data agrees with you that these blue styles are what's going to help you get there. And now we've really consolidated around where we want to go and what's going to help. And then the questions change to, I wonder what's actually currently taking place and what do we need to do to change that. Any questions about that? By the way, we have these in the Hightail. I dropped in both an English and German version. Marie, who's in this call, thank you, Marie, also was kind enough to create different versions of the wall chart exercise across the different levels. So the one that I provided to you is the culture deck, simply meaning that the items within each of those wall charts are items from the OCI. We also have a separate set, if you prefer, for teams that only includes items from the GSI, and a separate set for individuals from LSI and impact as well. So we have all of those in English and German. I didn't really want to drop, 8 of those decks on you unless you really want all of them. So I thought I'd give you the culture pieces first. By the way, as far as I'm concerned, you can also use the culture decks more broadly, but in any case, if you'd like additional sets, let us know, no problem to share those. Good. And also if you need additional languages, but you have the German and English versions, so have fun, they're fun. Well then, I will thank you guys for your time and participation. It was very nice to have you take part. See you again next week at 2 o'clock for another hopefully useful and informative session. If you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to reach out. And yeah, well, this is the first one we need to end it early. Thank you again.